Okay, all flight controllers, go for landing. Retro.
Go.
Fido.
Go.
Guidance.
Go.
Control.
Go.
Telcom.
Go.
GNC.
Go.
Ecom.
Go.
Surgeon.
Go.
Capcom, we're go for landing.
Altitude 4200.
Houston, you're go for landing, over. Roger, understand, go for landing, 3,000 feet.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are willing to fulfill, and one we intend to win.
To the right level. 30 seconds. Forward. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Hi YouTube. In this series of videos I will be explaining how I know we went to the moon. To qualify this statement a little, I am using the term we, in this case, to refer to mankind in general. And I am using the word know in its platonic sense, meaning that this is something I don't just believe to be true, but something I am justified in believing to be true. I think it's important to explain this because in almost all my encounters with those who believe the Apollo missions to be a hoax, I find that my position is the subject of astounded disbelief and ridicule, often followed by accusations that I am asleep, a paid agent, or I believe anything that my government, NASA and the BBC tell me. For those who are brave enough to watch, I will show that this is not the case. I have done the research, far more than is reasonably required to demonstrate that an event in history occurred, and far more than most people I meet with an opinion on the subject. These events happened. That is the only position on the matter that a reasonable, sane person can hold. I should add here what I will not be doing, at least in this first series. I will not be addressing arguments relating to shadows pointing the wrong way, or flags waving when they shouldn't, or any of those common Apollo hoax arguments. Of course I am aware that these mostly poorly informed arguments exist. I have already addressed one or two of them on this channel, and I hope to address many more in a second series of videos at some time in the future. In this first section I will be detailing exactly what NASA claimed to have done on the Apollo missions and how they claim to have done it. I think it's important to have a good understanding of this before I can set about presenting the evidence for it. If you are already familiar with the Apollo missions, feel free to skip this first chapter or skip back and use it as a reference if you need to. But I recommend that you strap in and enjoy a half-hour trip into the history and technology of mankind's greatest achievements in engineering, exploration and manned spaceflight. The mission timings used are from Apollo 11. The Saturn V was a three-stage liquid-fueled launch vehicle developed to support the Apollo program. Successfully launched 13 times from the Kennedy Space Center, as of 2016 the Saturn V remains the tallest, heaviest and most powerful rocket ever brought to operational status, and holds records for the heaviest payload launched and the largest payload capacity to low Earth orbit. Built by Boeing, the Saturn V's S1C stage was 42 meters long and 10 meters in diameter. At launch it weighed over 2,000 metric tons, that's about the same as 12 jumbo jets. Most of this weight was fuel contained in the two enormous fuel tanks, the top one for liquid oxygen and the lower one for RP1, a highly refined form of kerosene. These two fuels were mixed and burned at a rate of nearly 8,000 litres every second by the 5 F1 rocket engines, the most powerful rocket engines ever built. Together these rocket engines produced more than 7.5 million pounds of thrust. 4 of the engines were mounted on an outer ring and gimbal for control purposes. The 5th engine was rigidly mounted in the centre. The S1C stage was jettisoned 2 minutes and 42 seconds after launch at an altitude of 61 kilometers. This was followed 30 seconds later by the aft interstage, which protected the Stage 2 engines during the launch. 6 seconds after this, the launch escape system, which could lift the command module containing the astronauts clear of a catastrophic explosion early in the launch, was also jettisoned. The Saturn V's S2 stage was built by North American Aviation, 24.9 meters long, 10 meters in diameter, and weighing 481 metric tons. Its 5 J2 rocket engines produced 1 million pounds of thrust and were fueled with liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen contained in a single tank but separated by a common bulkhead. The S2 stage burned for 6 minutes, taking the spacecraft to a velocity of 15,000 miles an hour and an altitude of 184 kilometers before it was jettisoned. The third stage S4B booster was built by Douglas Aircraft Company. It was 17.8 meters long, 6.8 meters in diameter, and weighed 115,000 kilograms. It was powered by a single J2 engine fueled with liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. This was fired twice, first for 2.5 minutes to put the spacecraft into an Earth parking orbit. After 1.5 Earth orbits, the engine was fired again for the translunar injection burn. This lasted 5.2 minutes and accelerated Apollo to an altitude of 190 miles with a velocity of 24,500 miles an hour to escape from Earth's orbit and enter into a free return trajectory to the Moon. About 10 minutes after the translunar injection burn, the transposition and docking maneuver began. First, the command service module was separated from the adapter section of the S4B by firing an explosive cord. This also jettisoned the 4 adapter panels, exposing the top of the lunar module. The command module pilot then used the command service module thrusters to move the command service module a short distance away and turn it around to align with and face the top of the lunar module, and then moved it back towards the lunar module. The command module pilot used a target to stay aligned. A soft dock was achieved when the probe at the top of the command service module was inserted into a hole in the centre of a cone-shaped drogue at the top of the lunar module, and 3 small capture latches closed. Hard dock was achieved by activating a mechanism which retracted the probe and caused 12 more capture latches to close around the command module's docking flange. The command service module and the attached lunar module continued on their trajectory to a lunar orbit. The spent S4B and adapter panels would eventually crash into the Moon. The command service module was built by North American Aviation. It was 11 meters long and 3.9 meters in diameter. It consisted of 2 segments: the command module, a cabin that housed a crew of 3 and equipment needed for re-entry and splashdown, and a service module that provided propulsion, electrical power and storage for various consumables required during a mission. The service module was an unpressurized cylindrical structure. The interior was a simple structure consisting of a central tunnel section, 1.1 meters in diameter, surrounded by 6 pie-shaped sectors which contained fuel tanks containing Aerosine 50 as fuel and nitrogen tetroxide as the oxidizer. These fed the AJ10137 engine, which produced 20,500 pounds of thrust. Liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, which fed the fuel cells which produced electrical power. The same liquid oxygen supply provided breathing oxygen for the crew. On the outside of the command module was the engine nozzle, a steerable unified S-band high-gain antenna for long-range communication with Earth, and reaction control jets for steering. The command module consisted of 2 basic structures joined together, the inner pressure shell and the outer structure. The inner pressure shell was made from an aluminium honeycomb core sandwiched between aluminium face sheets. The outer structure was made of stainless steel honeycomb brazed between steel alloy face sheets. An ablative heat shield on the outside of the command module protected the capsule from the heat of re-entry. This heat shield was composed of phenolic epoxy resin, a type of reinforced plastic. During re-entry, this material charred and melted away, absorbing and carrying away the intense heat in the process. The heat shield has several outer coverings, a pore seal, a moisture barrier, and a silver mylar thermal coating. The heat shield varied in thickness from 5 cm at the base of the capsule, which faced forward during re-entry, to 1.5 cm in the crew compartment and forward portions. The command module attitude control system consisted of 12 93-pound force attitude control jets. 10 were located around the aft of the module, with 2 pitch motors in the forward compartment. 4 tanks stored the monomethylhydrazine fuel and a nitrogen tetroxide oxidizer. At the front of the command module was the docking probe for connecting with the lunar module, and the drogue and main parachutes used in re-entry. Inside the crew compartment was the drinking water supply and storage areas for equipment and food. On the right sat the lunar module pilot, in the centre the command module pilot, and on the left the mission commander. The Apollo astronauts used 3 navigation systems to determine the proper flight paths to the Moon and back to Earth. These systems were used jointly or separately. Together they formed the primary guidance and navigation system, referred to on the mission as PINGS. PINGS was developed by the MIT Instrumentation Laboratory. The prime contractor for PINGS and the manufacturer of the Inertial Measurement Unit, or IMU, was the Delco division of General Motors. The IMU was gimbaled on 3 axes. The innermost stable member, a 6-inch beryllium cube, had 3 gyroscopes and 3 accelerometers mounted in it. Feedback loops used signals from the gyroscopes to control motors at each axis. This servo system kept the stable member fixed with respect to inertial space. The IMU was derived from the guidance system developed by Draper for the Polaris missile. Inertial guidance systems are not perfect, and the Apollo system drifted by about 1 milliradian per hour. Thus it was necessary to realign this inertial platform periodically by sighting on stars. The command module had a fixed sextant and alignment optical telescope, which could measure angles between stars and Earth or Moon landmarks and planetary horizon. The unit included a scanning telescope for star sightings and could be used to determine the position and orientation in space. The operation essentially consisted of selecting 2 appropriate stars from the computer's catalogue, pointing the sextant at each of them and giving a mark to the computer when the reticle in the optics is aligned with each of them. The computer knows where these stars should be. The sightings are telling the computer where the stars really are with respect to the IMU's orientation in space. The computer can calculate the error in the IMU's alignment and how much the gimbals that support the IMU need to be rotated to bring it back into perfect orientation. Despite the word primary in its name, PINGS data was not the main source of navigation information. Tracking data from NASA's Deep Space Network was processed by computers at Mission Control. The position and velocity estimates that resulted were more accurate than those produced by PINGS. As a result, the astronauts were periodically given state vector updates to enter into the Apollo guidance computer based on ground data. PINGS was still essential to maintain spacecraft orientation, to control rockets during maneuvering burns, and as a source of navigation data during planned and unexpected communication outages. PINGS also provided a check on ground data. The Command Service Module and Lunar Module continued their 3-day journey to the Moon, tracked by Mission Control in Houston. The spacecraft was put into a slow roll of 2 revolutions per hour to provide uniform solar heating. However, this was stopped during navigation sightings and course corrections. Still influenced by the Earth's gravitational pull, the spacecraft gradually slowed down to about 2,040 miles per hour at 39,000 miles from the Moon. But as the Earth's gravitational effect continued to weaken, the Moon's gravity began to dominate, and the spacecraft speeded up again to about 5,600 miles per hour until it was eventually pulled into a slingshot trajectory around the back of the Moon. 75 hours and 49 minutes after launch, the command module engine was fired for a 6-minute lunar orbit insertion burn, with a further 17-second burn some 4 hours later to circularize the lunar orbit. The lunar module pilot then prepared the lunar module for separation and landing. The Apollo lunar module was the lander portion of the Apollo spacecraft, built by Grumman Aircraft to carry a crew of 2 from lunar orbit to the lunar surface and back. It was capable of operation only in outer space. Structurally and aerodynamically, it was incapable of flight through the Earth's atmosphere. The lunar module was 7 meters high and 9.4 meters square with the landing gear deployed, and consisted of an ascent stage and a descent stage. The octagon-shaped descent stage was supported by 4 folding landing gear legs and contained a throttleable descent engine with 4 hypergolic propellant tanks. It also contained fuel, water and oxygen supplies and batteries for electrical power. Equipment for lunar exploration was carried in the Modular Equipment Stowage Assembly, or MESA, a drawer mounted on a hinge panel dropping out of the left-hand forward compartment. The MESA contained a television camera with a tripod. As the commander opened the MESA by pulling on a lanyard before descending the ladder, the camera was activated to send the first pictures of the astronauts on the surface back to Earth. The opposite compartment contained the lunar surface experiments to be deployed by the astronauts. On the final 3 missions, the lunar module also carried the lunar rover, which folded into and somewhat protruded from the right-hand forward quadrant. An antenna was mounted by the engine heat shield on the bottom surface to send altitude and rate of descent data to the guidance system and pilot display during the landing. Almost all external surfaces were covered in amber, black, silver or yellow aluminized Captain foil blankets for thermal insulation. These insulation blankets had at least 25 layers. Contact points between the layers needed to be minimized so that heat wouldn't be passed through them by conduction. To achieve this, each layer was hand crinkled. The ascent stage contained the pressurized crew cabin with instrument panels and flight controls. It had its own ascent engine with 2 hypergolic propellant tanks for return to lunar orbit and rendezvous with the Apollo Command Service Module. It also contained a reaction control system for attitude and translation control. A forward EVA hatch provided access to and from the lunar surface, while an overhead hatch and docking port provided access to and from the command module. Internal equipment included a life support system, a VHF communication system with 2 antennas for communication with the command module, a unified S-band system and steerable parabolic dish antenna for communication with Earth, an EVA antenna which relayed communications from antennas on the astronauts' portable life support systems through the lunar module, primary and backup guidance and navigation system and an alignment optical telescope similar to those on the command module, rendezvous radar with its own steerable dish antenna, and an ice sublimation system for active thermal control. Electrical storage batteries, cooling water and breathing oxygen sufficient for a lunar surface stay of 48 hours initially, extended to 75 hours for the later missions. During rest periods while parked on the moon, the crew would sleep on hammocks slung crosswise in the cabin. The entire ascent stage structure was covered with a thermal and micrometeoroid shield, which combined a blanket of multiple layers of aluminized polyimide sheets or Captain H film and aluminized polyester sheet, mylar, with a sandwich of Iconol skin, Iconol mesh and nickel foil, or in some places a polyimide blanket with a single sheet of aluminium skin. The combined thermal and micrometeoroid shield was mounted on low thermal conductive supports or standoffs, which kept it at least 2 inches from the main structure. The aluminium or Iconol skin, the outermost material, serves as a micrometeoroid bumper. The sandwich and blanket material serve as thermal shielding. 100 hours and 12 minutes after launch, the lunar module separated from the command module with 2 astronauts on board. 2 hours and 21 minutes later, the lunar module fired its engine in a 9-minute 30-second powered descent to set it up for landing on the lunar surface. "102 hours and 45 minutes after launch, engine shut down. The lunar module lands on the surface of the moon. The astronauts immediately began preparations to leave in case of an abort situation, or soon after began preparing for the EVA or extravehicular activity, the exploration of the moon. The Apollo spacesuit, designated the A7L, was manufactured by ILC Dover, a division of Playtex, who were chosen because of the high-quality workmanship of their seamstresses and the unique flexible rubber concertina sections at the joints of the pressure garment, which allowed the astronaut much greater mobility. The A7L consisted of a constant wear garment for comfort, a liquid cooling garment which removed the astronaut's body heat, a pressure garment assembly with a nylon restraining layer to maintain its shape, a bubble helmet with communications headset and gold-plated visor assembly, Covering the pressure garment assembly was an Integrated Thermal Micrometeoroid Garment, or ITMG. This garment protected the suit from abrasion and protected the astronaut from thermal solar radiation and micrometeoroids, which could puncture the suit. The garment was made from 13 layers of material, which were, from inside to outside, rubber-coated nylon, 5 layers of aluminized mylar, 4 layers of non-woven dacron, 2 layers of aluminized Kapton film beta marquisette laminate, a layer of Teflon-coated beta filament cloth. Additionally, the ITMG used a patch of chromal R woven steel for abrasion protection from the portable life support system backpack. Chromal R was also used on the uppers of the lunar boots and on the EVA gloves. Finally, patches of Teflon were used for additional abrasion protection on the knees, waist and shoulders of the ITMG. The A7L also included a waste management system for urine collection and fecal containment, and a personal life support system, or PLIS, to provide breathing oxygen, the cooling system for the liquid cooling garment and communications. The astronauts on board the lunar module worked their way through a number of checks to ensure the lunar module was in good shape and ready for the return flight. They took a short meal break and then began preparations for the EVA, donning their personal life support systems and eventually depressurizing the lunar module. They finally opened the hatch of the lunar module at a mission time of 109 hours, 7 minutes and 33 seconds, and Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon at 109 hours, 24 minutes and 12 seconds, or 2:56 and 12 seconds GMT on the 21st of July 1969. With Buzz Aldrin joining him 19 minutes later. The EVA lasted for 2 hours and 15 minutes. During this time, the astronauts collected soil and rock samples, conducted mobility tests, conducted soil mechanics tests, took many photographs, and deployed scientific experiments including the laser ranging retroreflector, which will give experimenters on Earth a means of accurately measuring the distance between their telescopes and the reflector. A series of distance measurements will yield important information about the Moon's motions. The passive seismic experiment was used for measuring meteorite impacts and moonquakes. The lunar dust detector measured the amount of dust accumulating on the lunar surface. The solar wind composition experiment collected atomic particles released by the Sun into space and was returned to Earth by the Apollo 11 crew for analysis. Later missions were able to make progressively longer EVAs and deployed additional scientific experiments known as the Apollo Lunar Surface Experiment Package, or ALSEP, which included the Active Lunar Seismic Experiment, the Lunar Surface Gravimeter, the Lunar Atmospheric Composition Experiment, the Lunar Ejector and Meteorites Experiment, additional retroreflectors, the Passive Lunar Seismic Experiment, the Charged Particle and Lunar Environment Experiment, the Lunar Triaxis Magnetometer, the Suprathermal Ion Detection Experiment, the Low Energy and Medium Energy Solar Wind Experiments, and the Lunar Heat Flow Management Experiment. These experiments were arrayed around a central station which supplied power generated by a radioisotope thermoelectric generator to run the instruments and communications so data collected by the experiments could be relayed to Earth. The final 3 Apollo missions carried an electric-powered lunar roving vehicle, or LRV, which allowed astronauts to extend the range of their EVA. Built by Boeing and General Motors Defense Research Laboratories, the lunar roving vehicle had a mass of 210 kilograms and was designed to hold a payload of 490 kilograms. The LRV was released from the lunar module by the astronauts using a system of pulleys. Most of the deployment was then automatic. The rear wheels folded out and locked in place when they touched the ground. The front of the rover could be unfolded, the wheels deployed, and then the entire frame let down to the surface. The rover components locked into place upon opening. Cabling, pins and tripods would then be removed and the seats and footrests raised. After switching on all of the electronics, the vehicle was ready for use. The frame was 3 meters long with a wheelbase of 2.3 meters. The height of the vehicle was 1.1 meter. The frame was made of aluminium alloy tubing and consisted of a 3-part chassis that was hinged in the center so it could be folded up and hung in the lunar module quadrant 1 bay. It had 2 side-by-side foldable seats made of tubular aluminium with nylon webbing and aluminium floor panels. An armrest was mounted between the seats, and each seat had adjustable footrests and a Velcro fastened seatbelt. A large mesh dish antenna was mounted on a mast on the front centre of the rover. The suspension consisted of a double horizontal wishbone with upper and lower torsion bars and a damper unit between the chassis and the upper wishbone. Fully loaded, the LRV had a ground clearance of 36 centimetres. The wheels were made from zinc-coated woven steel strands attached to the rim and discs of formed aluminium. The chevron-shaped treads were made from titanium. Power was provided by 2 36-volt silver-zinc potassium hydroxide non-rechargeable batteries. These were used to power the drive and steering motors and other equipment, including the TV camera. A T-shaped hand controller situated between the 2 seats controlled the 4 drive motors, 2 steering motors and brakes. After completing the EVA, the astronauts returned to the lunar module, which was then repressurized. The astronauts ate and rested, and on later missions they made further EVAs on subsequent days. The lunar module was depressurized a final time before departure in order to save weight by dumping any waste and any items that were no longer required. To rejoin the command service module, the astronauts fired the ascent stage rocket engine and lifted off at a mission time of 124 hours and 22 minutes, leaving the descent stage on the moon. The ascent stage engine was fired for 7 minutes and 15 seconds, taking the ascent stage to an initial orbit of 11 by 55 miles above the moon. 1 hour and 19 minutes later, the reaction control system was fired to circularize the orbit at about 56 miles, some 13 miles below and slightly behind the command module. Subsequent firings of the reaction control system brought the 2 spacecraft closer together until they docked at a mission time of 128 hours and 3 minutes. The rock samples and other items were unloaded from the lunar module, and 4 hours later it was jettisoned into a lunar orbit. At a mission time of 135 hours and 23 minutes, the command service module engine was fired for 2.5 minutes in a trans-Earth injection burn. Following this, the astronauts slept for 10 hours. They made a small mid-course correction at 150 hours and 40 minutes, and made 2 TV transmissions during the trans-Earth coast. Re-entry procedures were initiated on July the 24th. 44 hours after leaving lunar orbit, the service module separated from the command module, which was reoriented to a heat shield forward position. Parachute deployment occurred at a mission time of 195 hours and 13 minutes, and after a flight of 195 hours, 18 minutes and 35 seconds, about 36 minutes longer than planned, Apollo 11 splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, 13 miles from the recovery ship USS Hornet. In total, Apollo astronauts spent over 81 hours exploring the moon. They travelled over 53 miles on the surface and collected more than 391 kilograms of rock and soil samples. Soon after each mission, NASA published a preliminary science report. These extensive reports got longer as the mission lengths increased. This final one from Apollo 17 comprised of 650 pages. Every aspect of the mission was reported upon, including the selection of the landing site, a full summary of all of the photography, geological analysis of the landing site, extensive analysis of each of the rock samples, a description of each of the lunar surface experiments, the equipment used, and an analysis of the data that was returned, and comparisons and cross-references of the data from different experiments. These reports provide a detailed scientific overview of each Apollo mission. Since their publication, over 3,000 scientific papers and articles have been published for peer review using data obtained on the Apollo missions. As we have seen, extensive documentation exists detailing every aspect of the Apollo spacecraft and their engineering. including thousands of photographs and many hours of film and video. The spacecraft were constructed by numerous contractors, and details of all the engineering involved is available for anyone to inspect. The missions returned data from numerous scientific experiments, and that data was and continues to be examined by experts in various scientific fields. Some of the best independent evidence for the Apollo missions are the numerous earthbound observations of various parts of the space operations. What many people seem to forget is that when you launch such a large spacecraft on such a journey, it can be seen and tracked from Earth. It seems somewhat ludicrous that this series requires that I present evidence for the launch of the mighty Saturn V rocket, but such is the nature of living in the great information age. There are actually people who claim that rocket launches are the product of some great David Copperfield Statue of Liberty type illusion. So here goes. Each Apollo launch was witnessed by hundreds of thousands of people. They lined the beaches, the roads, and even the rivers surrounding the Kennedy launch site, along with thousands of press reporters, photographers, TV and film crew from all around the world. The Saturn V can be seen on TV footage up to an altitude of over 75 miles, which is considered to be in space by any standard. Beyond the launch, there are many accounts of telescope sightings and even a few naked eye sightings of the spacecraft in flight. Many of the images shown are reproduced from press scans of the time, so they aren't great by modern standards. Beginning with Apollo 8, the first post-launch sightings came from the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory Station on Maui, Hawaii. The first image shows the TLI burn as the spacecraft left Earth parking orbit on December the 21st. As the spacecraft passed Hawaii, the changing perspective put the camera's view looking at the sunlit exhaust plume. A NASA recovery team leader deployed to the South Pacific aboard the carrier USS Yorktown, both for planned recovery and in case of early mission abort, reported that the crew had an excellent view of the TLI from the carrier deck and that a similar sight was visible from the USS Hornet for Apollo 11. As Apollo 8 began its climb outward from Earth, several amateur astronomers in the UK photographed a fuel dump from the expended S4B stage shortly after 1800 UTC on December the 21st. This event was seen without prior notification by F. Kent, Alan Heath and MJ Oates, who reports catching the cloud visually while getting off a bus. This photograph is by MJ Hendry from Colchester, UK, who took a 3-minute exposure beginning at 1816 UTC on December the 21st, showing blowout of excess fuel from the third stage. Mr. Hendry notes that one of his 14 pictures was taken almost simultaneously with one of the SAO tracking camera pictures from San Fernando, Spain, so that the spacecraft was displaced against the background stars by parallax at a range of about 50,000 kilometers. In Kent, well-known amateur astronomer Commander H.R. Hadfield made several tracking photographs. One of them was published in the Daily Mirror, along with an unusually detailed background. From the Spanish Naval Observatory in Cadiz came this photo of the Apollo 8 dump, which was well seen from Spain. The May 1969 article in Sky and Telescope notes that the S4B vented fuel, liquid hydrogen, and oxidizer, liquid oxygen, separately in perpendicular directions, which appears in the two distinct clouds here. The first opportunity for large telescopes to view Apollo 8 en route to the Moon fell to the Pic de Midi Observatory in the French Pyrenees. Dr. Michael Maltsoulas reported an initial sighting near 1710 UTC on December the 21st through the finder of the 1.1 meter reflector telescope as an object moving eastward near the predicted location of Apollo 8. Maltsoulas moved to the 60 centimeter refractor because of a drive problem at the reflector, observing a cluster of objects. These are obscured by the appearance of a nebulous cloud at a time which matches a firing of the service module engine to ensure adequate separation from the S4B. This event can be traced with the Apollo 8 flight journal. The separation burn of the service propulsion system engine was performed at 4:45 elapsed time, matching the French site's observed time. The Catalina station of the Lunar and Planetary Observatory, University of Arizona, shot this picture from the 1.54 meter telescope, showing the spacecraft, S4B booster stage and some panel reflections. In the background, the stars trailed as Apollo 8 was tracked. Observations visual and photographic were made with JPL's Table Mountain 61cm telescope on December the 22nd, 23rd and 24th. On the same nights, a team using the 61-inch astrometric reflector telescope of the US Naval Observatory in Arizona saw 1 steady and 4 flashing objects on the 22nd of December, photographing all but the 2 faintest flashing ones. By the 24th, the spacecraft registered photographically but did not appear visually, as it was closing in on the Moon and became lost in its glare. Although more than halfway to the Moon on December the 23rd, the command module appears as a bright trail within a star triangle. On each night during Translunar Coast, TV images using an image orthicon were obtained by resident director Justus Dunlap and staff members at Corralitos Observatory, New Mexico, then operated by Northwestern University. They obtained over 400 short exposure intensified images, giving very accurate locations for the spacecraft. The module is a faint moving dot in these 3 TV views. Also from Corralitos Observatory is this composite image made from 2 photographs taken 2.5 minutes apart and showing the movement of the spacecraft. The stars appear as horizontal pairs, but the spacecraft components are shifted diagonally. Anthony Farrell and Daniel Weidman observed Apollo 8 on December the 23rd from 1:50 to 2:37 UTC using the 2.1 meter Struve telescope at the McDonald Observatory of the University of Texas. On the 35th anniversary of this sighting, Mr. Weidman wrote, "My wife and I were spending our first Christmas and were at McDonald's where I was observing on the 82-inch. Everybody was celebrating the reports from Apollo, so I decided to take a look for it. It was easily seen as a moving object in the telescope. I invited all the staff who lived at the observatory and other visitors who were there to come and look at Apollo 8. It was a wonderful Christmas Eve experience for everyone, although it would have been spoiled if we had known how little would remain 35 years later of the Apollo promise." The Lick Observatory of the University of California produced live TV pictures during the return coast to Earth on December the 27th, which were broadcast to West Coast viewers via KQED TV in San Francisco. Here the spacecraft is in the leftmost of the 2 bright dots at the bottom of the image. In this second image, the spacecraft has moved to the top right. NASA deployed aircraft with photographic pods to track the Apollo 8 re-entries. One captured this sequence of 4 images showing Apollo 8 and numerous bits of debris, presumably from the service module, appear, as well as the fireball around the command module. As reported in National Geographic, May 1969, page 624, the Apollo 8 re-entry was seen by a plane load of passengers, thanks to Captain James Holliday flying Pan Am Flight 812, a Boeing 707 en route from Fiji to Honolulu on December the 27th, 1968. On spotting the re-entering spacecraft to port, he announced its location to the passengers. He noted, "We watched as the colour of the capsule brightened to pinkish red, and we noticed a tail similar to that of a comet directly behind. The tail was short at first, a dull orange streak. As Apollo 8 gradually came closer in the star-filled black sky, its glow changed from soft orange to yellow and finally to incandescent white. The orange-red tail grew longer and more vivid. It did not flare, it was perfectly straight and of constant thickness, like the slash made by an artist on a piece of black velvet. We estimated the length of the tail at 125 miles. We watched the spacecraft for 3 minutes. By that time I had turned the plane around a full 180 degrees to follow it." Another Pan Am flight from Honolulu to Sydney had a ringside view described in an article on page 2 of the Sydney Sunday Telegraph for Sunday, December the 29th, 1968. Numerous sightings of Apollo 10 and a photo from LUNAR Observatory were reported in Apollo 10 Optical Tracking in Sky and Telescope magazine, July 1969, pages 62 and 63. The report states, "More than 100 astronomers, principally in the United States and Europe, joined together to track progress of the Apollo 10 mission on the 18th to the 26th of May 1969. Trajectory data supplied by the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston were converted to pointing data for each observatory by Bellcom Incorporated, Washington, D.C. and Boeing in Seattle. The optical tracking network included about 15 major observatories, the worldwide Baker-Nunn satellite tracking cameras, and about 80 amateur groups. Although the weather was uncooperative and reflection from vehicles was fainter than expected, some observatories did sight the Apollo mission during trans-lunar and trans-Earth coasts. On the evening of the 18th of May 1969, the Command Service Lunar Module, the S4B booster, and the 4 adapter panels were sighted. On the evening of the 19th of May, Mount Wilson, Catalina and Lick observatories saw 2 objects, presumably the Command Service Lunar Module and S4B, which flashed randomly at 13th magnitude. During the lunar orbits, limb and terminator crossing times were announced, and several observatories attempted to sight the vehicles. The low orbital altitude next to the bright lunar disk apparently prevented anyone from making a positive sighting. On the return phase of the mission, the Command Service Module was observed during both operations. On the evening of 24th of May, it was sighted by National Geographic Society personnel in Washington, D.C. Measured photometrically at Mount Wilson and seen visually by the Los Angeles Astronomical Society. On the final evening of observations on the 25th of May, both Corralitos Observatory and Mount Wilson tracked the Command Service Module for 3 or 4 hours. Sightings of Apollo 11 and a photograph from Table Mountain Observatory were reported in Observations of Apollo 11, Sky and Telescope magazine, November 1969, pages 358 to 359. The report reads, in this 12-minute exposure, taken at 5:12 to 5:24 UTC on the 24th of July 1969, on the home stretch, the spacecraft shows as the diagonal streak. There were few sightings from North America during the outbound journey due to clouds over many sites. However, Brian Fennerty reported, when Apollo 11 was outbound towards the moon, I was in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, and saw the mission on its way with my own eyes, from Saks Point Park by the ocean. One of the newspapers published a map showing where to look in the evening sky on 2 consecutive nights, showing where each night the craft would show as a point of bright light. Since I knew enough about what was normally visible, it was unmistakable. A systematic campaign to secure visual and photographic observations of the Apollo 11 spacecraft during its July journey to the moon were organised by Bellcom Incorporated, Washington, D.C. Before launching on July the 16th, they distributed detailed predictions to a network of almost 200 amateur and professional astronomers, including many members of the American Association of Variable Star Observers. Due to the significant parallax of the spacecraft at the distances involved, individual pointing angles were computed for each observing site. At intervals during the mission, on the basis of up-to-the-minute data obtained directly from the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, updated pointing angles were telephoned to the major observatories participating in the program. Corrections were also broadcast over the Astronet amateur radio network. Using the 26-inch refractor at Leda McCormick Observatory, V. Oswalds and T. Frederick saw the spacecraft at 3 a.m. on July the 17th, on the first night of the flight to the moon. At Chabot Observatory in Oakland, California, searchers with the 29-inch Brasher refractor telescope spotted Apollo 11 on July the 18th, shortly after 4:25 UTC. At the Dominion Astrophysical Observatory, Victoria, British Columbia, a team were able to detect the spacecraft with the 48-inch reflector. They reported, "We were quite hampered by a bright sky and low altitude, but we could see the spacecraft moving at the correct rate through a field of several faint stars." Observers on Mount Coban in southernmost British Columbia were able to see the spacecraft during the last evening of the return journey. In Colfax, California, on July the 17th, Bill Fisher and Leonard Taylor glimpsed several flashes between 4:55 and 5:12 UTC using the 12-inch reflector from the Sacramento Valley Astronomical Society's observatory. From the favourable southern hemisphere vantage point of Brisbane, Australia, Victor L. Matchett reported success on July the 24th at 11:03 UTC, when his 12-inch reflector revealed 3 10th magnitude flashes near the predicted place. Watching carefully, he saw a 13th magnitude object drifting slowly and steadily southeastward for over 90 minutes. In Riverside, California, using an 8-inch reflector on July the 17th from 4:10 to 4:20 UTC, Clifford Holmes saw two flashing objects of about 10th magnitude near the expected position. Qantas pilot Frank Brown saw the re-entry of Apollo 11 from a Boeing 707 near the Gilbert and Ellis Islands, today Kiribati and Tuvalu respectively. He described what he saw in this radio interview with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. The video is a recording of the re-entry by a specially equipped NASA tracking aircraft.
Fortunately, it's gone right on our right. We'll let you know in a few seconds what the position is.
The apparent path of Apollo 12 was widely reported in the UK press. Taking advantage of rapid clearing after rain, Jonathan Silverlight used a 75mm refracting telescope from a London suburb to make this sketch of the S4B and surrounding cloud on the 14th of November 1969 at 1920 UTC, almost 3 hours after launch, which would make this sighting right around the end of the TLI burn. Its notes show that it was a prominent naked-eye object. Here is a TV image of Apollo 12 at the tip of the labelled arrow, accompanied by two of the flashing SLA panels below the right arrow. This was taken at 0200 UTC on the 14th of November 1969, at a range of about 50,000 miles. An image intensifier was used on a 16-inch telescope. Numerous visual and photographic reports of Apollo 12 were given to Optical Observations of Apollo 12 Sky and Telescope, February 1970, pages 127 to 130. Among these were the following series of sketches by Maurice Gavin, done from Worcester Park in the UK. This series was made from 2105 to 2120 UTC on November the 14th, 1969, during the second venting of the liquid oxygen from the S4B. At a range of about 110,000 kilometres, the team at Coriolis Observatory was the first to record a water dump from an Apollo spacecraft. The sequence below spans the interval 421 to 446 UTC on November the 15th. The ejected water cloud, marked here with a W, is seen moving away from the spacecraft, marked SC. Numbers 1 to 4 indicate tumbling SLA panels. These are image orthocon TV images. This image of Apollo 13 is similar to the Apollo 12 example in provenance and shows a water dump at 0214 UTC on the 13th of April 1970. In this image from Table Mountain Observatory, we see Apollo 13 at 5:23 to 5:28 UTC on April the 12th, 1970, 2 days before the explosion. Ron Welch visually observed Apollo 13 outbound at about 100,000 kilometers range using the Zeiss half-meter Cassegrain telescope at Auckland Observatory in New Zealand. Two Coriolis images showing fading of the oxygen cloud created by the explosion were reproduced in The Apollo 13 Accident in Sky and Telescope magazine, July 1970, page 14. Jim Gallivan, who made these observations, gave this account. We had been following the spacecraft with coordinates NASA computed for our position. The panels would flash at regular intervals. When the explosion happened, it was obvious something strange had happened. I remember my wife asked me if I thought the astronauts were still alive. Immediately after the explosion, I called NASA. We kept watching the spacecraft and reported the coordinates and the direction of the ejected materials to NASA. There was quite a bit of drama at Houston, and the astronauts were not sure what had happened, and we were able to visually report on what we saw. Copies of the imagery we took that night were flown on a special flight to Houston. We were expected to continually track the spacecraft for NASA and had a lot of images of its progress. I am very sure Coriolis was the only site to take a photograph or see the actual explosion. We kept the photos away from public release until Apollo 13 had safely returned, which was not a certain thing. Later they were published in the New York Times and later in Sky and Telescope magazine. For Apollo 14 and 15 we had network TV trucks on site monitoring our imagery of the flights. These images showing the Apollo 13 explosion cloud were taken by a team using the 0.4 meter telescope on Mount Coban in British Columbia, who were photographing the spacecraft en route to the moon, and captured this before and after set, here rotated to have north at the top. Meanwhile, the S4B booster continued toward the moon. Here is a Naval Observatory 1.54 meter telescope image of the booster, 230,000 kilometers from Earth, flashing as it tumbles. The shutter was closed for 1 of every 5 minutes during this 10-minute exposure to provide timing information. At Chabot Observatory, members of the East Bay Astronomical Society have been tracking the moon flights. EAS members received an urgent call from NASA Ames Research Station, and they put the observatory's historic 20-inch refractor to work. They were able to send the needed data to Ames, and the Apollo crew was able to make the needed correction and return safely to Earth. Terry Galloway, team leader for Apollo tracking at Chabot University, provides more detail as follows. We did team with Belcom of Washington DC and NASA to conduct optical tracking of Apollo spacecraft from Apollo 7 through 17. We supplied the rotational rate decay of the ejected SLA panels, which was used to help quantify the tiny residual atmospheric air resistance at the high altitude flights. We were also asked to provide our best positional coordinates of the tracked spacecraft from the specular reflection against the backdrop of stars in order to refine Belcom's orbital computations. We noted water dumps, spacecraft separations and redocking timings, etc. Some photographic documentation was done on selected missions when there were spectacular visual events. We did this observational work with Chabot's 3 telescopes, with the able assistance of many high school students and some college students. I think we were most noted for our observations of Apollo 13, as the only observatory with clear skies and tracking Apollo 13 at the critical time. In response to NASA's urgent phone call, we provided NASA Houston with critical real-time positional information to assist in the manual re-entry of Jim Lovell and his crew. The re-entry was seen by the crew and passengers of an Air New Zealand DC-8 bound from Fiji to Auckland. A full account was given in the next morning's edition of the Auckland Star. Peter Gabelish was among the passengers and supplies the following recollections based on entries he made in a pocket diary at the time. I found myself on a southerly flight across the Pacific to Auckland, with the vague feeling that our route would be close to Apollo 13's re-entry trajectory. I was on my way home from a stint in the US, and Apollo 13 was big news, particularly in the States, as the 3 crewmen on board the stricken spacecraft fought for their lives. We were no sooner seated for takeoff than a rather excited pilot announced, "You may or may not be aware that we are expected to see Apollo 13's re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. We are in communication with Houston and will be the first to see the returning spacecraft. Houston want us to remain in contact until the vehicle's recovery." Much excitement on board, as everyone who had a camera set it up for the spectacle. Fortunately, I had a camera that allowed me to set shutter speed, aperture, etc. Unlike the average modern camera that won't let you do much except point and shoot. Having figured out what I thought would work, I proceeded to advise a fellow passenger on settings. It turned out that he was a professional photographer, assigned by a newspaper for the event. I hope he appreciated my advice, as my photos came out beautifully on my basic equipment. With the cabin lights out, we waited expectantly. Running about 2 minutes behind schedule, a brilliant fireball, like a massive, very bright light, appeared over the starboard horizon. Travelling horizontally, an incandescent silver plume of brilliant light, leaving a brilliant trail of constant width behind it, arced in from the west at an altitude that didn't appear to be much higher than ours. The silver phosphorescent tail it left behind seemed to retain its brilliance as a curved band of luminescent material, while the leading body continued at a constant velocity across our path. I presume the tail to be the vaporized aluminium and magnesium materials from which the capsules were mostly constructed. My reaction was that no one could live through the incredible fireworks and that all must be lost. Every few seconds a bright yellow-orange spark would branch off the main spearhead and arc away on a different trajectory. The incredible display continued across our path and arced towards the eastern horizon on our port side. The inferno diminished while still within our sight. When it died out, a minute red dot continued on the eastbound path, curving out of sight over the horizon. This was the command module with its glowing heat shield that had survived the impossible inferno and miraculously had living humans alive inside it. I would guess the whole display lasted 3 to 4 minutes. We were fortunate that the whole re-entry was seen in total darkness. Several minutes afterwards, day began to break and the trail of the vaporized metal was visible hanging in the upper atmosphere for the next 20 minutes or so, affording me the chance to photograph it as it hung there. The next morning the Auckland Star carried a photograph of the re-entry, proclaiming that the passengers on our flight had been the sole witnesses to the sight of a lifetime. It seemed that their photographer was lucky enough to get it right too. Perchance he used the settings I gave him. These are just a few examples of the many earthbound observations made during the Apollo missions. As we have seen, there are hundreds of eyewitness accounts from numerous international locations. Observers include the man in the street, aircraft full of passengers, newspaper reporters, and amateur and professional astronomers. Throughout the Apollo program, every part of the spacecraft journey to and from the moon was observed from Earth and often recorded using the means available at the time. Water dumps, TLI burns, stage separation and re-entry operations were observed at times and places congruent with published information about the missions. These accounts and observations show that large objects matching the exact size and configuration of the Apollo craft were sent to and from the moon. The Apollo missions were not only tracked optically. There are a number of accounts from people who are able to receive radio transmissions directly from the spacecraft. The first of these comes from a 1960s conspiracy theorist. It seems that distrusting NASA is not a new idea. In July of 1969, a Louisvillian by the name of Larry Basinger accomplished an amazing feat. He independently detected signals from the Apollo 11 astronauts on the lunar surface. Fortunately, his accomplishments were recorded and promptly published in the Louisville Courier-Journal by another Louisvillian by the name of Glenn Rutherford. In an article entitled Lunar Eavesdropping, Louisvillians Hear Moonwalk Talk on Homemade Equipment, the story appeared in the July 23, 1969 issue of the paper. Here are some extracts. In the late 1960s, Basinger was an amateur radio astronomer with an interest in NASA, in astronomy, in UFOs, and in other such things that were hot topics at the time. He experimented with satellite tracking and capturing pictures of Earth transmitted from weather satellites. He had some success in these matters. For example, he was able to print out crude images from weather satellites using an impact printer that printed using carbon paper. These interests and efforts led to the idea that he might independently verify the information that NASA had been providing about the Apollo program. Could he get unedited, unfiltered information about the Apollo 11 landing by eavesdropping on the radio signals transmitted from the lunar surface? And could he find out things that NASA did not want the public to know about? Most of all, successfully detecting a transmission from the lunar surface would be a great technical accomplishment. Various local experts said it could not be done. On the night of the Apollo 11 eavesdropping effort, Basinger said he and Rutherford had to essentially bore sight their antenna on the moon by getting behind it and sighting it like a gun. This was difficult since the weather was cloudy and the moon was not easily visible. The antenna's beam or field of view was such that once pointed at the moon, it could be let go for a little while. But pretty soon it would have to be re-aimed because the Earth's rotation caused the moon to drift out of the field of view and the signal to be lost. In fact, this was one piece of evidence that once the receiver started picking up Apollo 11 signals, the signals were indeed from the moon. If the antenna was not kept aimed at the moon, the signal disappeared. Basinger's wife and daughter watched the Apollo landing on TV. while Basinger and Rutherford listened via Basinger's equipment. The signal on the home-built equipment came through approximately 5 to 10 seconds earlier than the signal on TV. Basinger said he found nothing that NASA edited out. Comments about things going wrong, the astronauts being loose with their language, or exclamations about meeting aliens. He said no, absolutely everything was transmitted to the public on TV. In fact, he said, that was kind of disappointing. Part of the idea of this project was to hear the unedited real story, and it turned out that nothing was edited out. Indeed, Rutherford's story makes no mention of hearing anything unusual. A hobby group at Kettering Grammar School in the UK, using simple radio equipment, monitored Soviet and US spacecraft and calculated their orbits. According to the group, in December 1972, a member picked up Apollo 17 on its way to the moon. The Russian website Novosti Kosmonavtiki features an article written by E. Molotov. The article describes the initiative to use the 30-meter dish near Simferopol in the Crimea for tracking Apollo missions. The initial justification was that this would be the first realistic way to test the Soviet network of land and ship-based stations for their own planned lunar missions. He describes how the Soviets were able to receive voice, telemetry and TV transmissions from the Apollo spacecraft. Sven Gran has a detailed account, including detailed descriptions of the technology involved of his successful attempts to receive communication from Apollo 17 in 1972 on his website. Here are some extracts. On November the 29th, 1972, the day of my visit, the moon rocket Apollo 17 was on its launcher, a few hundred meters from the beach of the Atlantic. It had been there since August, and in the Launch Control Center, preparations were going on for picking up the final countdown the following morning. In the Vehicle Assembly Building, work was going on around the clock with the next big space project, Skylab. On top of a large Saturn V booster, the work and living sections of the space station was mounted. The airlock and the astronomical observatory were still missing. At my visit, a so-called refrigeration test was going on, i.e. the system that keeps the sunny side of the station cool and the shadowy side warm were being tested. The countryside around the rocket base was very much changed on launch day. The liftoff was scheduled for 10 o'clock at night, but already at noon campers and tourists gathered on the mainland coast north and south of Titusville. I arrived at about 11 AM with my friends from the Physics and Astronomy department of the University of Florida. We set up a tracking station near a fruit stand on the beach just south of Titusville, which was equipped to receive Apollo 17 on 258.5 MHz for telemetry from the last stage of the booster, and 259.7 MHz and 296.8 MHz up and downlink AM voice signals from the spacecraft. This tracking station consisted of a variety of homemade and surplus units. Using this equipment, we plan to pick up signals during the launch phase and during 2 subsequent transits over Florida before the spacecraft would be propelled out of its parking orbit and into a moon-bound trajectory. The countdown proceeded smoothly, and the spectators spent the time eating sandwiches and making music. Others watched a big rocket with large telescopes in which you could almost see the rivets in the tank walls of the huge bird. The liftoff finally took place at 33 minutes past midnight local time, December the 7th, 1972. Our little Titusville station picked up strong voice signals up to 8 minutes after launch on 259.7 MHz. Thanks to the clear weather, the ignition of the second stage was clearly visible from the ground some 3 minutes after liftoff. We were lucky and got through the traffic jam and out of the rocket base very quickly, and got back to Titusville in time for the first transit of the spacecraft over Florida at 8 minutes past 2 local time, 7:08 UTC on December the 7th. We picked up the very characteristic PCM buzz on 258.5 MHz. Shortly after hearing the telemetry signals, we also picked up voice signals on 2596.8 MHz. The astronauts were chit-chatting with ground, and we tracked the spacecraft across the sky with the helix antenna. When Apollo 17 was due south of us, we could clearly hear an astronaut say in our loudspeaker, "I just saw a shooting star over Miami." As Apollo 17 approached the horizon in the southeast, the crew could be heard calling, "Houston, 17, how do you read?" On the next transit, the spacecraft passed very close to the local horizon, and telemetry and voice signals were picked up weekly between 3:43 and 3:46 local time. A few minutes later, Apollo 17 was fired out of Earth orbit and changed from VHF transmissions to microwaves. After a few days' rest, we started preparations for microwave monitoring of Apollo communications. My radio astronomy friends had mounted a 9-meter dish at the old radio observatory of the University of Florida. The aluminium dish was Air Force surplus equipment. The receiver used for tuning the Apollo frequency, 2287.5 MHz, was a Motorola unit, surplus from the Apollo program itself. On December the 10th, 1972, we picked up our first signals on S-band. Apollo 17 passed over the lunar disk between 1722 and 1819 local time, and during these 37 minutes we measured a total Doppler frequency shift of 43 MHz. On December the 11th, 1972, the lunar module landed on the moon, and at 15:18 local time we picked up main carrier and telemetry from the surface of the moon some 80 minutes after touchdown. Unfortunately, the astronauts soon changed to low power, which prevented us from getting voice signals because of the too low signal-to-noise ratio. We decided to shift back to the frequency of the command module in lunar orbit, and on December the 11th we could pick up our first voice signals from the moon. At 17:22 local time, Ron Evans said, "Stand by 30. 30 seconds later we abruptly lost the signal as the spacecraft swung around the edge of the moon. The following day, December the 12th, 1972, we concentrated on the command module and received strong voice signals on several occasions. On one of these occasions, we heard Ron Evans say, "The barber pole is grey," referring to a barber pole-shaped control panel indicator. On December the 4th, 1972, I left Gainesville for Sweden. At Kennedy Airport, I watched the astronauts leave the moon on a little pay TV which you could find on many seats in the air terminal. And so, the Apollo program was all over. These accounts show that radio broadcasts of voice and data were sent from the moon at times and locations congruent with published information at the time. Quoting from James Hansen's biography of Neil Armstrong, First Man, The Life of Neil A. Armstrong, "For those misguided souls who still cling to the belief that the moon landings never happened, examination of the results of 5 decades of laser-ranging retroreflector experiments should evidence how delusional their rejection of the moon landing really is. As you may remember from the first section, the Lunar Surface Experiment package included retroreflectors. These were deployed on the lunar surface by the astronauts on Apollo 11, 14 and 15. The Soviets also mounted retroreflectors on their Lunokhod 1 and Lunokhod 2 robotic rovers. These retroreflectors consist of an array of corner cube prisms which reflect light directly back in the direction it came from. Scientists on Earth can aim high-powered pulse lasers at the retroreflectors and measure the time it takes for the light from the laser to reflect back to Earth. These high-precision measurements of the Earth-Moon distance contribute to the foundations of our knowledge in gravitation and planetary physics. Here is the result of a lunar laser ranging experiment. The dots show when photons are received from the Moon. The dark line shows that a number came back at a specific time, and hence were reflected by something quite small, well under a meter in size. Photons reflected from the surface come back over a much broader range of times. The whole vertical range of the plot corresponds to only 30 meters or so in range. The concentration of photons at a specific time appears when the laser is aimed at the Apollo 11, 14 or 15 landing sites. Otherwise, the expected featureless distribution is observed. While being the most evident force of nature, gravity is in fact the weakest of the fundamental forces, and consequently the most poorly tested by modern experiments. Einstein's general relativity, currently our best description of gravity, is fundamentally incompatible with quantum mechanics and is likely to be replaced by a more complete theory in the future. A modified theory would, for example, predict small deviations in the solar system that, if seen, could have profound consequences for understanding the universe as a whole. By mapping the shape of the lunar orbit, lunar laser rangefinding is able to distinguish between competing theories of gravity. Range precision has improved from a few decimeters initially to a few millimeters recently. Leveraging the raw measurement across the Earth-Sun distance provides another 2 orders of magnitude for gauging relativistic effects in the Earth-Moon-Sun system. As lunar laser rangefinding precision has improved over time, the technique has remained at the cutting edge of test of gravitational phenomenology and probes of the lunar interior, and has informed our knowledge of Earth's orientation, precession, and coordinate systems. Many scientific experiments have taken place which utilize lunar laser rangefinding. Here are some examples. Since retroreflectors were first deployed on the Moon, many observatories around the world have conducted laser rangefinding experiments. The Soviet unmanned mission LUNAR-1 soft-landed on the Moon in the Sea of Rains on November 17, 1970 at 3:47 UTC. The lander had dual ramps from which the payload LUNAR-1 could descend to the lunar surface. At 6:28 UTC, the rover moved onto the Moon's surface. The rover would run during the day, stopping occasionally to recharge its batteries via solar panels. At night, the rover hibernated until the next sunrise, heated by the radioactive source. Controllers finished the last communications session with LUNAR-1 at 13:05 UTC on September 14, 1971. Attempts to re-establish contact were finally discontinued, and the operations of LUNAR-1 officially ceased on October 4, 1971, the anniversary of Sputnik 1. The final location of LUNAR-1 was uncertain until 2010, as lunar laser ranging experiments had failed to detect a return signal from it since 1971. On March 17, 2010, Albert Abdrakhimov found both the lander and the rover in this Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter image. In April 2010, the Apache Point Observatory Lunar Laser Ranging Operation Team from the University of California at San Diego, also known as Apollo, used the LRO images to locate the orbiter closely enough for laser ranging distance measurements. On April 22, 2010, and days following, the team successfully measured the distance several times. The intersection of the spheres described by the measured distances then pinpoint the current location of LUNAR-1 to within 1 meter. The Apollo team is now using LUNAR-1's reflector for experiments, as they discovered to their surprise that it was returning much more light than other reflectors on the Moon. The lunar laser rangefinding experiments show that the retroreflectors are on the Moon at the positions of 3 Apollo landing sites. The experiments conducted meet the strictest requirements of the scientific method and have been repeated many thousands of times over the last 5 decades by thousands of scientists from many nations. The Apollo missions returned 391 kilograms of rock and soil samples. These samples show obvious signs that the rocks were formed on the Moon and not here on Earth. Here is a photo of a terrestrial rock called olivine gabbro under a microscope. The bland, mostly featureless areas are made mostly of plagioclase feldspar, a calcium aluminium silicate. The fractured grains that appear to stand out in relief are olivine, a magnesium iron silicate. The greenish material along the cracks and the brownish material on the edges of the olivine are water-bearing minerals derived from the alteration of the olivine. The feldspar looks slightly dusty, peppered with tiny inclusions, also the result of alteration. Now we see a very similar lunar rock. The clear areas are plagioclase feldspar and the very light yellow areas are olivine. The dark brown material is a titanium silicate material called titanite. What leaps out in comparing the two pictures is the complete absence of water-bearing minerals and the total absence of alteration in the lunar rock. Water is everywhere on Earth. It is present in magma, Rocks deep in the crust are changed by hot fluids, and rocks near the surface are altered by surface water. Olivine in particular is easily altered. In the second picture the olivine is fractured, but the fractures are absolutely clean. You simply do not see unaltered olivine on Earth. This could not have been faked. The rocks have grains easily visible to the unaided eye, which means they cooled slowly. To have made these materials synthetically would have required keeping the rocks at 1100 degrees centigrade for years, cooling them slowly at thousands of pounds per square inch pressure. It would have taken years to create the apparatus, years more to get the hang of making the materials, and then years more to create the final result. Starting from Sputnik 1 in 1957, there would not have been enough time to do it, and you'd have to synthesize several different types of rock in 100-pound lots. And the results would have to be convincing. NASA distributes over 400 samples a year to research scientists and educators around the world. NASA's Curation Lunar website lists thousands of samples from all of the Apollo missions and includes descriptions and microscope photographs. Researchers can request samples on loan, including samples of pristine material, and then subject them to any non-destructive tests they choose. This could include, for example, X-ray examination to determine the chemical composition. So faked specimens would have to stand up to any kind of scrutiny that researchers might give them. Whoever came up with the faked specimens would have to have devised a story of lunar evolution to fit the samples. The story would have to have checked out in every detail. For example, rare earth element abundance and evidence of meteor impact. Why create absolutely water-free rocks? At the time, nobody was expecting that. It would have been much easier to fake rocks with water in them. For one thing, you could use terrestrial rocks, and nobody would have been suspicious. And you'd have to put in exactly the right amount of radioactive elements and daughter products to get the rocks to date radiometrically at 4 billion years old, older than any terrestrial rocks. You also have to anticipate the development of new dating methods not in use in 1969, and make sure that those elements are present in the correct abundance. And it's not just like adding carrots to a stew either. To mimic the results of potassium-argon dating, you have to add inert argon gas and trap it just in the potassium-bearing minerals, and in exact proportion to the amount of potassium. Then the story has to stand up to scrutiny for decades, even in the face of new research methods not in existence in 1969. For example, when lunar meteorites are discovered in Antarctica, they have to match the Apollo samples. If you believe NASA has the technical ability to pull all this off, going to the moon is a piece of cake in comparison. The Apollo 11 press kit, pages 220 to 241, lists well over 100 investigators who were to receive Apollo 11 lunar rock samples, and only includes those investigators who had put their names forward as at July 1969. Ultimately, there were many more. They include researchers from 10 countries, most of them based in universities. Since then, lunar rock samples have been used in research all around the world. National Geographic, December 1969, contains a preliminary article about the Apollo 11 rocks on pages 788 to 791. Worthy of note there is a comment from Dr. S. Ross Taylor of the Australian National University. The moon rocks are different enough from Earth rocks to keep us busy for years. In November 1969, the then US President Richard Nixon requested that NASA create approximately 250 Apollo 11 lunar sample displays containing lunar surface material and the flags of 135 nations, US possessions and states. Each presentation included 0.05 grams of Apollo 11 moon dust in the form of 4 small pieces encased in an acrylic button, as well as the flag of the recipient nation or state, also flown on the first manned lunar landing mission, and an inscribed plaque. President Nixon had similar displays prepared after the final Apollo 17 mission. These are known as the Apollo 17 Goodwill displays. These were given to heads of state around the world and to each North American state via the State Department. These are the countries that received them. While other Goodwill moon rock commemorative plaque displays were reported lost or missing by several recipient countries, Both the Netherlands Apollo 11 and Apollo 17 Goodwill Moon Rock commemorative plaque displays are in the country and accounted for. In 2009, the Rijksmuseum of the Netherlands declared that the Goodwill Moon Rock it had received in 1992 from the estate of former Netherlands Prime Minister Willem Drees was bogus. Testing had showed it to be a piece of petrified wood, likely from Arizona. An investigation showed that United States Ambassador J. William Middendorf II had presented Drees with the Moon Rock on October 9, 1969, at the opening of an exhibition on space exploration. The Apollo 11 astronauts were visiting the Netherlands at the time on a goodwill tour. Drees' grandson speculates that his grandfather formed the mistaken impression that the moon rock he received was from the Apollo 11 mission. Middendorf, who lives in Rhode Island, told Dutch broadcaster NOS News that he had gotten it from the US State Department, but couldn't recall the exact details. "I do remember that Drees was very interested in the little piece of stone," the NOS quoted Middendorf as saying. "But that it's not real? I don't know anything about that." Rijksmuseum spokeswoman Sandra van Gelder, who oversaw the investigation that proved the piece was fake, said the museum will keep it anyway as a curiosity. "It's a good story with some questions that are still unanswered," she said. "We can laugh about it." The museum had vetted the moon rock with a phone call to NASA, who told them that it was possible the Netherlands had received a rock. NASA gave moon rocks to more than 100 countries in the early 1970s, but they were from later missions. Apparently no one thought to doubt it, since it came from the Prime Minister's collection, Van Gelder said. The rock is not usually on display, as the museum is primarily known for its paintings and other works of fine art by masters such as Rembrandt. It was mounted and placed above a plaque that said, "With the compliments of the Ambassador of the United States of America," to commemorate the visit to the Netherlands of the Apollo 11 astronauts. The plaque does not specify that the rock came from the moon's surface. It was on show in 2006, and a space expert informed the museum it was unlikely NASA would give away any moon rocks 3 months after Apollo returned to Earth. Researchers from Amsterdam's Free University said they could see at a glance the rock was probably not from the moon. They followed up the initial appraisal with extensive testing. "It's a nondescript, pretty much worthless stone," geologist Frank Björk concluded in an article published by the museum. He said the rock, which the museum at one point insured for more than $500,000, was worth no more than €50. Van Gelder said one important unanswered question is why Drees was given the stone. He was 83 years old in 1969 and had been out of office for 11 years. On the other hand, he was the country's elder statesman, the Prime Minister who helped the Netherlands rebuild after World War II. What this story shows is that despite claims of religious and emotional dogmatism, it was a space fan who first pointed out this anomalous rock, and just a cursory inspection by an informed eye confirmed it to be of terrestrial origin, showing us that the differences between moon and earth rocks are very obvious. This rock seemingly did not follow the route of any other lunar rock sample. It didn't seem to have been issued by NASA for research, and it wasn't one of the goodwill displays. Ultimately, the claim that it was from Apollo 11 came from a single elderly man. Lunar rocks have obvious features which show that they could not have formed on Earth, and they exist in quantities that could only result from a manned lunar mission. The samples have been examined and rigorously tested by thousands of researchers from many nations over 5 decades. Further observable, testable, repeatable evidence that man landed on the moon. Although there have been no manned missions to the moon since Apollo, there have been a number of unmanned missions which have completed detailed exploration of the lunar surface. These include China's Chang'e 1 and 2 orbiters and Chang'e 3 lander, India's Chandrayaan-1 orbiter, Japan's Selene orbiter, and the most impressive, NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance orbiter. Each of these spacecraft has revealed previously unseen detail which verify the Apollo missions. Using Google Moon, we can tour the Apollo landing sites and take a look at the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter images of each site. Each site has been photographed during different phases of the Moon, and I have combined these images into short animations where the changing light conditions add depth to the imagery. For the first lunar landing, the Sea of Tranquility was chosen because it is a relatively smooth and level area. It does, however, have a high density of craters, and in the last seconds before landing, the lunar module had to be manually piloted by Neil Armstrong to avoid a sharp-rimmed ray crater measuring some 180 meters across and 30 meters deep, known as West. The lunar module landed safely some 6 kilometers from the originally intended landing site, approximately 400 meters west of West Crater. The Apollo 12 landing site was on a broad ray associated with the crater Copernicus, which is located approximately 370 kilometers to the north. Apollo 12 landed on the northwest rim of the 200-meter diameter Surveyor crater, in which Surveyor 3 touched down on April 20, 1967, in the eastern part of the Ocean of Storms. The Apollo 14 landing site was located about 30 miles north of the Frau Moro crater, the same site selected for the aborted Apollo 13 mission. The hilly region was designated the Frau Moro Formation, a widespread geological area covering large portions of the lunar surface around the 700-mile-wide Sea of Rains, the largest recognizable impact structure on the Moon, and is thought to have been formed by a major impact of a huge mass colliding with the Moon during the period when the Earth and planets were forming. The Frau Moro Formation is believed to be made up of an ejector blanket thrown out from that impact. Frau Moro debris may come from as deep as 100 miles below the original lunar crust, and return samples provide evidence of when the Sea of Rains basin was formed. A recent impact near the landing point formed Cone Crater. The Apollo 15 landing site was located at the foot of the Apennine mountain range. The Apennines rise up to more than 15,000 feet along the southeastern edge of the Sea of Rains. Hadley Rill is a V-shaped gorge paralleling the Apennines along the eastern edge of the Sea of Rains. Some scientists believe that these rills were caused by some sort of fluid flow mechanism, possibly volcanic. The hilly region around Descartes crater in the Lunar Highlands was the landing site chosen for Apollo 16. The landing site had two basic terrains that were explored and sampled: the Cayley Plains and the Descartes Formation, made up of hilly, furrowed highland plateau material. Analysis of the samples showed that these geologic units were made up of debris generated by impact events, perhaps from the formation of a large lunar basin. The landing site for the final Apollo lunar landing mission, Taurus Littrow, takes its name from the Taurus Mountains and Littrow crater, which are located in a mountainous region on the southeastern rim of the Serenitatis Basin. Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter images haven't just captured the Apollo lunar modules. Many other spacecraft have been located, including the Apollo S-4B boosters, which were crashed into the Moon as part of the seismology experiment, and a number of other spacecraft from the USA, the Soviet Union and China. Now let's take a closer look at a landing site and see how imagery of it from different sources matches up. For this we are going to return to Hadley Rill, landing site of Apollo 15. But first, this.
The news is good from the spacecraft Lunar Orbiter, launched by this Atlas Agena rocket. The craft, bent upon a mission to find sites for the future Apollo manned flight, is functioning perfectly. The separation you see here in animation was duplicated in the heavens by the real thing. When the time came for it to spread its fins, it did not disappoint. On the scheduled 92nd hour, it began orbiting the Moon as neatly as our astronauts have been circling the Earth. The drawing board conception of moon orbit mechanics was reenacted, so now we await the report of these cameras, eyes set to record on film 3,000 miles of the Moon's equator in its search for landing sites. Mission accomplished, the pictures will be radioed to Earth in this wise and received by a giant antenna at Goldstone, California. Here, miracle-performing machines will convert the craft's messages into pictures, translations of millions of infinitesimal dots into visuals, reproductions that at first are decipherable only with the aid of super-powerful microscopes. Another finesse of computer legerdemain beyond the power of most of us to comprehend. But through the eyes of Lunar Orbiter, we'll soon know many of the secrets of the Queen of Night.
Before the Apollo missions, lunar mapping images came from the 5 unmanned Lunar Orbiter spacecraft. These were used to create maps and in the landing simulator. This is the best quality image of the Hadley Rill area before Apollo. It was taken from Lunar Orbiter 5 in August 1967. Zooming in on a section of the image, we can make out craters, but the detail is limited. In this video, produced by Gonta Plaid, we can see the 16mm film of the landing from inside Falcon, the Apollo 15 lunar module, alongside imagery from Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter overlaid in Google Moon. The audio is the original transmission from the spacecraft.
Altitude 5,200 feet. Manual attitude control is good.
Roger, copy.
Altitude 4,200.
Houston, you're a go for landing, over.
Roger, understand. Go for landing. 3,000 feet. Top alarm. 1201.
1201. Roger, 1201 alarm. We're go, same type, we're go.
2,000 feet. 2,000 feet. Into the ag, 47 degrees.
Roger.
37 degrees.
Eagle looking great, your go.
Altitude 1,600. 1,400 feet, still looking very good.
Roger, 1202, we copy it.
35 degrees. 35 degrees. 750, coming down to 23. 700 feet, 21 down. 33 degrees. 100 feet, down at 19. 540 feet, down at 30, and at 15. There's 400 feet down at 9. Gate forward. 10 and 50 feet down at 4. 33.5 down. They're pegged on horizontal velocity. 300 feet down, 3.5. 47 forward. Put up. On 1.5 down. 70. Got the shadow out there. 50 down at 2.5. 19 forward. Altitude, velocity, light. 3.5 down. 220 feet. 13 forward. 11 forward, coming down nicely. 200 feet. 4.5 down. 5.5 down. 160 feet. 6.5 down. 5.5 down. 9 forward. Good. 120 feet. 100 feet. 3.5 down. 9 forward. 5%. 180 bite. Okay, 75 feet. Car's looking good. Down a half. 6 forward. 60 seconds. Lights on. 6. Down 2.5. Forward. Forward. That's 40 feet down 2.5. Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Great shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward. Drift into the right a little. 20. Down a half. 30 seconds. Forward. Just. Good. Okay. Contact light. Okay, engine stop.
From this video we can see every single crater and rock in the LRO imagery matches that from Apollo, and we also know that this level of detail wasn't available before Apollo. Here is a comparison of images from Lunar Orbiter, Apollo and Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. We can see how little detail was available before Apollo. This still frame is taken from the landing film just before landing, just as the dust starts to be blown up. I have marked the prominent features with coloured arrows for comparison with an LRO image of the same area. As we can see, these details match and could not have been known at the time without getting very close to the moon. Speaking of dust being blown up, it's worth noting at this time that the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter image clearly shows a lighter area around the lunar module. And this area is also visible in this image from India's Chandrayaan orbiter, and in this image from Japan's Selene orbiter, where we can also see the darkened area around the ALSEP and the faint hint of a path between it and the lunar module. This image was taken from Apollo 15 itself. The command service module was equipped with a mapping camera, which captured this photograph on the 27th orbit of the moon at 23:52 and 54 seconds on the 31st of July 1971. This was at the end of the first EVA. When we zoom in on the landing site and compare it with the LRO image, we can see that the only trail visible in the Apollo 15 image is the one leading to the ALSEP, exactly what we would expect to see at this point of the mission. If we zoom in very close, we can just make out what appears to be an object casting a shadow just to the northwest of the lunar module, and we can see what this object is in this photograph, taken at the end of the first EVA. The lunar rover parked next to the lunar module. This photograph, again from Apollo 15's mapping camera, was taken earlier than the first on the 14th orbit of the moon at 2:12 and 23 seconds on the 31st of July 1971, around an hour before the first EVA. This time we can see the lunar module with no trail from it, no rover visible, and a longer shadow as we would expect to see for this time. There are a couple of nice oblique views of Hadley Rill, again from Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, taken from different directions, and the overhead view we saw earlier. These all show good detail of this small collection of craters on raised ground known as the North Complex. This was explored and photographed by the astronauts, so we can compare their photographs from the surface with the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter and other orbiting probes. This is also a good opportunity to make a quick point in passing. This is a photograph of the North Complex, and this is a photograph of another part of the North Complex, both taken by astronauts. This is a composite of photographs showing all of the North Complex. The fact that we have composited two photographs to make this image in no way invalidates anything that it depicts. Just saying. Here is a comparison of the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter views and the surface views with arrows to highlight some features. Once again we see everything matches perfectly. This is another panorama composite of Mons Hadley taken by the Apollo 15 astronauts, and this is an overhead shot of the same area taken by India's Chandrayaan-1 probe. If we zoom in on the marked area, we can pick out some details and compare them with the astronaut photos. Once again, fine details that could not have been known in the 60s without visiting the moon are verified by recent non-NASA probes. This oblique shot of the same area comes from Japan's Selene orbiter. Although we can't make out fine details in this one, we can see the topography is an exact match for the astronaut photograph. Indeed, it seems whatever details we test by verifying against other sources, the Apollo photographs and accounts check out. To really hammer this point home, let's take a quick look at one of the most enduring images of the Apollo missions, Earthrise. Taken on Christmas Eve 1968 by the crew of Apollo 8, the photograph we know so well was actually the second of a pair. The first photograph taken was this black and white one. The crew switched to a colour film when they realised the importance of what they were seeing. The photograph has been used in the media many times. Here are a few examples, so we can see that the image we can download today is the same as it was directly after the mission. The photograph was taken as Apollo 8 was flying over a large crater on the eastern limb of the moon called Pasteur. This area can only just be seen from Earth and always at a very oblique angle, so the details we see could not be known without visiting the moon. If we zoom in on the crater in the right foreground, we can pick out some details and again compare with China's Chang'e 2 and Japan's Selene orbiters. As we can see, the streaks and markings on the crater wall are exactly the same in each image. We can repeat this with the crater on the right of the image, and again the details match. It's also worth noting that both craters appear in the black and white image, only this time they are further into the background, as we would expect with this photograph being taken just before the colour one. As the crew were approaching the point where the Earth would be visible, they had been photographing the lunar surface using a camera fixed in a command module window and operating on a 20-second timer. It was as they began a roll manoeuvre to change the orientation of the command module that they first saw Earth. The timing of this manoeuvre is recorded precisely in the mission, and if we look at the images being taken at the time, plotted on Google Moon, you can see the effect it had on the photographs. I have added coloured borders here to make it easier to see the change in orientation. The timing of the photographs is well documented and can be found in the Apollo Flight Journal. From this data we can plot where they were above the surface and derive a distance between those 2 points. Apollo 8 was orbiting 112 kilometers above the surface, which when combined with a lunar diameter of 3,474 kilometers gives an orbital circumference of 11,618 kilometers. The time between loss of signal on orbit 3 and the same point on orbit 4 is 1 hour 58 minutes and 36 seconds. This equates to a speed of roughly 1.63 kilometers per second. The time elapsed between the first black and white photograph of Earthrise and the first colour one is 53 seconds, which means that they will have covered around 86.5 kilometers between the two. I measured the distance in Google Moon at 84.82 kilometers. Not an exact match, but close enough, I hope. We can recreate the two shots in Stellarium using the correct times and dates, and we can see the position and orientation of the Earth matches the photographs. Zooming in on the Earth, we can see the Terminator line and the continents in daylight are a match too. The S7 meteorological satellite, launched on October 2nd, 1966 for the US Department of Commerce, produced cloud maps daily for the northern and southern hemisphere. These were published for public use and could even be received directly from the spacecraft by suitably equipped amateurs. They were used by meteorologists around the world for weather forecasting. If we check the cloud maps for December the 24th, 1968, once again we find a perfect match for what we see in the Earthrise photograph. However we attempt to verify images of Apollo lunar surface activity, we find they always match the available reputable resources. Even the fine details down to individual rocks appear in images today exactly the same way they did in the Apollo era. The Google Lunar X Prize was announced in September 2007. The competition offers a total of $30 million in prizes to the first privately funded team to land a robot on the moon that successfully travels more than 500 meters and transmits back high-definition images and video. The first team to do so will claim the $20 million grand prize, while the second team to accomplish the same task will earn a $5 million second prize. Teams can also earn additional money by completing additional tasks beyond the baseline requirements, such as travelling further than 5,000 meters and capturing images of the remains of Apollo program hardware or other man-made objects on the moon. 5 teams from around the world have secured launch contracts for their spacecraft, and all of these missions will take place late this year. These are Moon Express from the USA, SPACEIL from Israel, Synergy Moon, an international team from 15 countries, Team Indus from India, and Hakuto from Japan. A further 7 teams who failed to meet the X Prize deadlines still intend to launch their vehicles. Of these, the Berlin-based PT Scientists has planned their mission to land in Taurus Littrow, 2 miles from the landing site of Apollo 17. From there they plan to drive their Audi Quattro rover to examine in close-up the Apollo 17 lunar rover and transmit high-definition video and photographs of the site. As there is a large cash incentive, other teams from the competition may also visit Apollo sites. Beyond this, there are a further 14 robotic missions planned to reach the moon in the next 3 years or so. That's a grand total of 26 planned missions by 16 separate organisations from 10 different countries. And in addition to this, the USA plan to orbit the moon next year with a crew of 4 in a test of the new Orion capsule. Japan, China, Russia and the European Space Agency all have proposals for future manned lunar missions. In response to this, NASA has produced this document, which offers guidelines to any private or foreign government organisation planning a lunar surface mission. It recommends descent and landing and overflight boundaries for the landers and hoppers, artifact boundaries for the robotic rovers, and visiting vehicle surface mobility boundaries, which provide suggestions for approach to get as close as possible to each site without disturbing any artifacts, and advice on how to avoid chemical or biological contamination of the site. They also suggest specific observations that should be made of the Apollo hardware in order to discover more about space weathering by seeing how specific materials have fared in the lunar environment. Unlike with many historical events, evidence for the Apollo moon landings is going to improve over time. And although not all of the aforementioned missions will visit Apollo sites, or even be successful, it seems likely that we are on the verge of a flurry of new high-quality Apollo evidence from non-NASA sources. If you are still clinging to the belief that these events were faked, well, it's only going to get worse for you. NASA are actively encouraging other organisations to inspect the Apollo hardware in close-up and report data from Apollo sites. This is not the action of an organisation that is trying to cover up a hoax. So we have seen that. Extensive documentation and photography exists detailing the engineering of the Apollo spacecraft. Complete voice transcripts and explanations of events are detailed in the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal, and we can verify some of these details with the hundreds of eyewitness accounts and photographs given by observers from all around the world and from all walks of life, from high school students to professional astronomers, who witnessed the Apollo spacecraft on their journeys to and from the moon. Radio transmissions from Apollo spacecraft were received and monitored by a number of independent witnesses, from schoolboys to hostile foreign powers. Observable, testable, repeatable evidence comes in the form of laser range-finding experiments that have been repeated thousands of times by many independent observers around the world, and in the lunar rock samples distributed to tens of thousands of researchers over 5 decades. When we seek out the fine details in the Apollo photography, we find that all the available sources match, from pre-Apollo weather satellites like ESA-7 to the latest orbiter from China. Everything is as we would expect to find it. Close independent inspection of the Apollo sites is likely to be imminent, and NASA are actively facilitating this. So, if you still believe these events were a hoax, consider for a moment how that hoax has been perpetrated. Firstly, who knew and knows about it now? If knowledge of the hoax was limited to a few NASA and US government elites, then everyone else working on the Apollo program would have been working to correctly fulfill their role in getting a manned spacecraft to the moon and back. The result of this would be the production of a spacecraft capable of doing exactly that, thereby negating any need for a hoax. If lots of people involved with the mission knew of the hoax, then how has this remained a secret? Loyalties change. Where are the confessions of disgruntled employees? Where are the deathbed confessions or posthumous document discoveries? If people have been bribed or threatened, where is NASA's whistle-blowing Frank Serpico? Where are the space engineers' mansions and fast cars? How is the hoax continuing? Orbiters from India, Japan and China all show evidence supporting the Apollo landings. How have people in their space programs been convinced to lie? Likewise with the scientists conducting the laser range-finding experiments. Have they all been in on it for nearly 50 years? Or are they being fooled somehow? And if so, how? The rock samples are sent out to anyone with a relevant and reasonable request. They aren't vetted for their loyalty to NASA. How have so many people been tricked for so long? Of course, it's possible to dream up fantastical ad hoc theories for how these problems might have been addressed. But before you propose them, consider if they are actually supported by any evidence, and if they aren't, consider why it is you believe them to be true. What I believe to be true is supported by evidence, lots and lots of it from multiple reputable sources. And that evidence tells us that there was no hoax and the Apollo missions happened. Thanks for watching. Please rate, comment and subscribe.